After years of siege, a symbol of civilian suffering in the Syrian war finally gets aid. But an air attack on Daraya means the relief is short-lived. Is a new chapter really being opened in aid delivery? And what more can agencies do to elicit the support of warring parties? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. For nearly half a decade, Syrians in the town of Daraya lived under siege with limited access to food and medicine at the hands of their own government. Well, on Friday, they received their first food aid delivery since 2012. But then came the barrel bombs. They were dropped by Syrian government helicopters. Residents say they prevented the food aid from getting to the people who needed it. Several international diplomats say they're frustrated with the situation.
I welcome the fact that a small amount of aid has got into Daraya and Medamir. It is atrocious that bombing has also continued in those areas and in Aleppo. The whole of the international community is united around the obligations on the Assad regime. They must provide the land access and they must stop the bombing.
France's foreign minister said, "I'm outraged beyond words. It's an extraordinary duplicity of the regime which we are witnessing." Friday's aid delivery to Daraya came after weeks of negotiations and international pressure on the government. And it's just one of several Syrian towns currently under siege. The UN estimates more than 500,000 Syrians are affected, but some groups like the Siege Watch project put that figure at more than 1 million. Around 500,000 people are believed to be trapped in the countryside outside the capital Damascus. In the province of Homs, an estimated 365,000 are besieged. Then in Idlib province, there are around 20,000 people trapped without adequate access to food and medicine. And in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria, an estimated 200,000 people are under siege. Let's bring our guests into the show now. Joining us in London, Neil Sammonds, Syria researcher at Amnesty International. In Cairo via Skype, Abeer Etefa, she's a senior spokeswoman for the Middle East at the World Food Programme. And here in Doha, Marwan Kabalan, a Syrian academic and writer. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Abeer, they say ladies first, so let's do it that way. How confident are you, Abeer, that a new chapter in aid delivery is being opened since we had the news of the government's agreement for aid to be delivered to all of the 19 besieged areas?
We wouldn't describe this as a new chapter. I think we've started with high hopes when the first convoys went into Madaya, went to Zabadani, to these areas, but few pockets remained unreachable and inaccessible. And we've said it all along that one time of convoys is not the solution. The solution is to have people accessible to all of the humanitarian agencies. Lifting the siege of the people is the solution and is the new chapter of humanitarian aid. But I think what we're seeing is business as usual, getting approvals every month for new convoys to get to the besieged areas. But whether really is that there is a major shift in the delivery of humanitarian aid across Syria, we would not describe it this way.
So, Abeer, is there no indication that this is about to become a regular process yet?
We hope it is, but I think this, what we learned from the Syria crisis for 5 years is that it has to withstand the test of time. And we don't know whether it's going to bear or hold on for a long period of time or not. And this is yet to be seen. We've started, like, since April, we've started having regular access to some areas. But again, a lot of negotiations, a lot of approvals, clearances, plans that have to be submitted and delivered back to the UN, adjustments. So I think what we really need is to see what will happen in the next few months and whether we will have this regular access to all of the people in besiegement. getting into 15 of this, or like 17 out of the 19 areas that are besieged is certainly a positive sign. But again, we don't know how long this will last. We're hoping to be able to access those people all the time, and all options are yet on the table.
Okay, so a lot of hope there, Neil. But business as usual, Abeer says. Neil, do you see the situation? Has anything changed in the situation of, well, perhaps at least in those 17 of the 19 areas that have received aid?
I think you'd say it's business as usual to the extent that we see so many people besieged across the country, and the overriding picture is that people are living without adequate access to food and water, medical assistance and so on. And just occasionally for agencies to be allowed to bring in small amounts of food and medical equipment, often with some of the most important needs taken out of them, you know, like surgical appliances and so on, is nothing to be praised. So like we're seeing with Daraya just over the last few days, that while aid did come in, there was the medical convoy, which had a lot of equipment not allowed into it, and then the later food one. They were preceded by and then followed by intense barrel bombing. So the regime is allowing certain things to happen, but it is not adhering to international humanitarian law. It's not adhering to the UN Security Council, which demands that the sieges must be lifted. So to that extent, business is as usual, and nothing is really changing in any meaningful way.
That's sad. Marwan, of course, Neil mentioned there the situation in Daraya, and we did see those really depressing pictures of what appeared to be barrel bombing campaign just hours after the aid trucks had dropped off some supplies. How do you read that? Is that the regime making a political point, or was there some pressing military objective in their mind that they needed to achieve?
Well, I think the regime for the past few years has been using actually siege as a weapon of war in this conflict.
But why do it at that point in time in front of the eyes of the world when people were celebrating the apparent...
Because I think the aid went into Daraya despite the will of the regime. The regime did not want actually any aid to get into Daraya, because the strategy has been for the past few years, as I said, like this. We are willing actually to provide you with food, with medicine, with everything, but you have to surrender. I mean, that is the equation for the regime. So why would the regime allow aid then without having a total surrender from the rebels in Daraya? This strategy has succeeded in many places for the regime. Like,
so what,
for example,
you're saying this was a deliberate attempt to prevent the aid from being delivered?
And we all know that because Russian officers actually went on the ground actually to supervise the entry of aid to Daraya. That was the only reason why actually we believe the regime allowed this time aid to go into this town. The Russians are putting huge pressure on the regime in order to allow this to happen. Why? Because we all know that in the meeting last month of the Syria support group, Britain suggested that if the regime doesn't allow aid to get into besieged areas, the aid must be actually dropped from the air, and the Russians did agree actually to the British proposal. So I think the Russians put huge pressure on the regime in order to allow the aid to go into Daraya. But otherwise, the regime wouldn't allow anything to get to enter Daraya unless, I mean, the rebels inside, I mean, the civilians, the rebels, the people who are living inside Daraya would totally surrender. This strategy, as I said, has been adopted by the regime for the past few years, and has been for the regime been successful so far, because it did actually lead to total surrender, like for example in the old town of Homs in 2014 and in many other places. So I think the regime will not...
so you think that's still the strategic goal?
I think that is the strategy of the regime, and I think they will just, they will not abandon it under the current circumstances.
Let me come back to Neil, if I may, in London. Of course, all parties, we're focusing here on the fact that the Syrian regime is accused of being responsible for most of the sieges going on, but all parties do interfere with the delivery of aid, don't they? It's quite a complex situation, isn't it, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. The Syrian government is the main perpetrator of sieges across the country. But yeah, Islamic State also is surrounding parts of Deir ez-Zor, opposition armed groups and other non-state actors have besieged Fuan, Kafreya, other parts of the country. So yeah, multiple actors are at play. The laws of war, as we've referred to already, state that civilians should not be disproportionately affected by sieges. I mean, a siege is allowed in war at the end of the day, but it should be of military targets, of military people, not of civilians. And we've seen time and time again that it is the civilians who are the primary targets of these sieges. It does seem to be used as a weapon of war to affect the civilians, to make life as hard as possible for people in those areas. I think particularly it's by the government forces in trying to make life as painful as possible for people there, and perhaps force them to either surrender, as has been said, or perhaps to move into government-controlled areas where they have better access. I mean, the overwhelming majority of aid that has come into Syria does go into government-controlled areas, which is a shame, because it's the areas which are not under government control which are in most need of it.
All right, Abeer, help us to understand, when an aid agency tries to negotiate with the government, with the regime, to allow aid delivery, I imagine you're probably not told, well, we don't want you taking aid in because we don't like the people in that area. What sort of bureaucratic or what sort of security reasons are you presented with that kind of stop you from doing your job or stall you from doing your job?
Well, as Neil mentioned, many communities are besieged by different parties to the conflict. There are different shapes and forms that impedes the delivery of aid and especially food into the areas. First of all, you would not get clearances, and you do need the clearances so that you can pass through the different checkpoints and you're able to move the convoys from one place to the other. Or community leaders will give you mixed messages on whether you can go or not. You get messages that your convoy is not secured, that this and this needs to happen. And a lot of it has to be preceded by a lot of local negotiations on the ground to allow the aid to pass on. And if you have seen in the beginning of the access to Madaya, that it was like, it's called the four-town agreement, which means that you have access to Foua and Kifraya, and in return you have access to Madaya and to Zabadani. And up till now, it is, you cannot get to one without the three others, or two without the two others. So it's kind of like,
So that, sorry to interrupt you, that equation is still there. It's literally feed our people and then we'll let you feed the others. Starve our people, we'll starve the others.
Absolutely. I would describe it as like you let go and I let go. So it's up till now, we call it the four-town agreement. So there are a lot of obstacles that get into that. And the basics of supplying and providing humanitarian aid is unconditional and unimpeded access, so that you can get to all the people who need the assistance. But in the case of Syria, and especially in the besieged areas, there has to be a lot of negotiations, a lot of clearances, multiple approvals, multiple words of, words from the different groups, so that we can and know that we can access these areas. And we've tried before, to move things under, of course, I'm speaking here about not just the World Food Program, but the UN agencies in general, that you try to move a convoy and then it will get stuck somewhere and it will return because you have not secured and spent these long hours and long days of securing all different parties to the conflict's approvals and clearances and assurances before you move one truck.
Yes, Sami, but I think here actually, if one, of course, I mean, we should be against siege which targets civilians in principle, yeah. But here we are talking about completely different amount of places and people who are under siege. Because if we take Kafraya and Foua in Idlib, for example, we have like 20,000 people who are under siege by the opposition groups. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, under government, we have like 1 million people who are under siege. So I think it's very difficult actually to put the two sides on equal footing when you talk about responsibility here.
Right, yeah, even the more perhaps conservative estimates do say that there are
at least 500,000.
Yes, of people, and the majority of them being under siege by government forces. Neil, it's almost mind-boggling to think, I mean, siege, I guess, for sure is something that one condemns, no matter who imposes it. But it's almost more mind-boggling to understand how a regime which claims to speak, a government which claims to speak in the interest of all of its people, rather than a group which, you know, claims to represent a particular faction, can stand on the legitimacy of being an internationally recognized government that cares about all of its people and then behave in such a factional way?
It is. It's a tragedy. It's the way, though, of the political world works, isn't it? So the Syrian government has legitimacy in the eyes of most countries and in the planet still. It's still a UN member. Countries are not able to carry out military operations in Syria legally unless they have the consent of the Syrian government. The Syrian government of Assad, of course, he followed his father. The political system which enabled him to be elected is far short of internationally accepted standards for democracy and so on. So you have a minority essentially dictatorship in power, and it's able to hold the strings around the country, and it can squeeze the bits that it dislikes and who have opposed it. So in talking about Daraya, as many people will remember, I mean, this is a city which has a long history of kind of like liberal progressivism. So, I mean, I went there in 2006. I met with people who had just been released from prison while others were still held. These people had been carrying out activities such as they had a peaceful march against the expected war on Iraq previously. They had opposed the smoking of American cigarettes for that reason. They had an anti-corruption campaign. They cleaned their own streets because they didn't think they were being done well enough by the state's services. And for that, many people were imprisoned. And of course, then we saw that so many activists peacefully had opposed the Syrian government forces when they went in Daraya. They put flowers and gave water to the soldiers and so on. But then these people got taken away and tortured to death. I think you can see that the Syrian government, or certain members of it at least, loathe Daraya. They loathe what it means for the country, this kind of resistance in a way against it. But as you say, yes, the government effectively is able to starve its own people, and it's getting away with it relentlessly, with impunity. And we need to see the people who are in charge of the country or making the decisions that those people are besieged and who are enforcing those sieges. These people need to be held to account. These people must be brought to trial. It's a long way off, I expect, but that's what we need to see.
All right, Abeer, aid agencies are in a difficult position here. You're in no position to hold anyone accountable. That's not even your job, understandably so. Your job is simply try and get aid to everyone who needs it. But in January 2016, we had 112 members of civil society in Syria accusing the UN of being complicit to the blockade. In their opinion, or their complaint was, by allowing the Assad regime to veto aid to civilians, as they put it, in areas outside the control, they say the UN is allowing itself to become a political tool in the war. And like I said, you know, you do a very worthy job, and it's a very difficult one, but is there anything else that an aid agency could do to guard against being seen as complicit to a blockade in that manner?
True honesty is that I think the UN agencies and all the humanitarian aid workers have done really their best in this conflict. Almost 30% of the World Food Programme food assistance was delivered to communities in opposition-controlled and hard-to-reach areas and besieged areas through cross-border corridors to Idlib, rural Aleppo, Daraya, Hasaka, as well as eastern Ghouta and many other places. Once the Security Council got out the resolution to allow aid to go cross-border, we've operated a huge and a massive operation from the Turkish border and from the Jordanian border so that we get food to the people who are under the control of the opposition. But when we are talking here about cross-line convoys, and when you're trying to get access inside Syria itself, and you have to pass by several checkpoints, and you have to pass by many actors, and you have to get government approvals.
What would happen, Abeer, forgive me for interrupting again, what would happen if you were to take up some of these demands or requests in this letter and do things like that they're calling for example, they say you're too reliant on getting approvals from the government. You're too close to the regime, they say. Your response to things like that, is any of that practical?
Well, UN agencies face very real security risks. We have staff working in very dangerous circumstances. More than 80 humanitarian workers have been killed in Syria, in the Syria conflict, and many others are missing. We take serious and repeated risks to reach people in need, in some cases coming under fire, under direct fire. We continue, and really, this is the basic of the operation of humanitarian aid. We called many times on all the parties to the conflict and those with influence over them to enable unconditional humanitarian access to all the people in need without discrimination, using all available routes. And to give you an example, even the Daraya convoy that went 48 hours ago, the delivery of the food assistance in this convoy happened under fire. So there are huge risks that have been taken, not just today, in the evacuation of the old city of Homs, in the delivery of food assistance of Homs. The staff have come near, they nearly missed being seriously injured during this time. So there have been high risks taken, but at the same time, there are realities on the ground that we cannot just ignore.
Right.
Well, on this point, Sami, if you allow me, of course, I don't agree. I don't accept actually the accusation of the UN of being complacent with the Syrian regime concerning the siege of these different areas. But I think in general, the UN reaction to the Syrian crisis was very weak, in my opinion, from the very beginning. But that takes us to a different question here and different territories, because the UN, at the end of the day, represent the will of the superpowers in the international community. And the superpowers in the international community have been, in fact, they stood idle, doing absolutely nothing to stop this conflict, in my opinion. And their endeavors, political endeavors to stop the crisis has not been, in my opinion, very sincere. So
I'm
so
glad
far.
you mentioned that point. Could I link it to a point you just mentioned at the beginning of the show, in that you were talking about how the government, you believe, only allowed the delivery of aid to places like Daraya because of intense pressure from the Russians. Do you, reading into that then, has there been a political change in position from some of the world powers? Is the impunity coming to an end?
No, I don't think so. I think the Russians are still very much behind the regime, supporting the regime, because, but here actually we have to distinguish between two different things. The Russians, they don't want actually to take the blame, much of the blame actually, for not actually putting enough pressure on the regime in order to allow aid to the besieged areas. And the Russians are under huge pressure, in my opinion. And this is when I said during last meeting, the Syria support group, actually the Russians, they agreed actually to the bridge proposal of actually dropping aid from air, to the besieged areas. But when it came to execution, I don't know what happens, because when the Syrian regime actually did not allow aid to go, for example, to Daraya or other places like in Wa'ar, in Homs now, no aid is being actually delivered. That
We're not
is the
seeing
decision.
the political will.
Yeah, but we are not seeing actually anybody trying to execute the decision which has been actually taken by the Syria support group during that meeting actually, and drop aid to this besieged area. And then we come with the complication that everybody will start talking about the security of the warplane, the planes that might actually deliver the aid, and many other complications
ideas that came out. All right, I think we've got about 40 seconds left. Neil, how have areas like Daraya survived for so long without aid? And if the situation is not changing, if it is business as usual, how are they likely to continue to have to deal with siege?
Well, the people have clearly suffered extremely. The majority of Daraya has fled. You have 4,000 or more left from 80,000 or more original population of 2011 or thereabouts. We know that there's very little potable water. It's very poor quality. There's lots of illnesses related to that. There's very small amounts of farming allowed. People are able to kind of try to grow things in broken buildings and on the edges of Daraya. But then, of course, the Syrian government continues to target that. People live essentially in bunkers, although for the last 3 months, until the latest rounds of barrel bombing, people were able to come up, have their lessons above ground, but otherwise they had lived in in darkness. There's lots of people with eye problems, lots of young children who can't see very well because they've basically been living as subterranean animals hiding from barrel bombs. So unfortunately, it's a very, very difficult life for people in Daraya.
It's a sad scene that one hopes we will see an end to very soon. Let's thank our guests because we are out of time. Neil Sammonds, Abeer Etefa and Marwan Kabalan. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle there, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, is goodbye.